So right at the end of our temperature conversion version 3, we said that if the user gave us the right conversion type, we were going to display the conversion numbers to them. But if they didn't give us those numbers, we wanted to do something else. And that's where the if else comes in. So this is what it looks like. We have our classic if with a condition and the colon and the tab in, but we can add an else to that, which is obviously optional. We hadn't had it up until that very last moment. So when the if does not run, the else automatically will. This is what it looks like. So if class start time is greater than or equal to 8, print got to get to class, otherwise, else, print what were they thinking? As in, who in the world would hold classes that early? So let's try some of these back in Code Sculptor. All right, we're going to learn a little bit of hummingbird facts along with our if else. So I'm going to prompt somebody for the name of their hummingbird, and then we're going to give them some information about it. So as a quick review of an if statement, I'm going to say if the bird's name or if name is equal to Speedy, I'm going to print that's not very original. The only way we're going to get that one to run is a capital Speedy spelled correctly, and it will print something. All right, so how about if we do an if else? So I would like to ask them, how fast do your bird's wings beat? Or better yet, how fast do Speedy's wings beat? So I'm going to change this string inside of this input just a little bit in order to be able to say, how fast do Speedy's wings beat, given the name of the bird. So this is what I would really like it to say. How fast do Speedy's wings beat? We learned that we can do a string format, which I've sometimes called a print format, but it's actually a string format. So I'm sure that Speedy is actually just the bird's name. So I can customize my prompt by doing a string format and putting the name of the bird in there. So next I want to build an if statement on the bird's speed. So if their speed is between 50 and 200, that is within the average speed of a hummingbird. So I added an if speed is greater than 50 and speed is less than 200, tabbed in to print George is within the average speed of a hummingbird, whatever the name of the bird is. But what if the bird is not between 50 and 200? So on line 15, I added an else with a colon and then tabbed in to print George might be sightseeing. I mean, if a bird is not within his average speed, what is he probably doing? Sleeping, flying with the wind, maybe sightseeing. Let's run it and see if it works so far. So the name of the hummingbird, I'm going to say George. Because I personalized the input prompt on line 11, it should say, how fast do George's wings beat? There it is. It looks like my string format worked well. And then if I put something between 50 and 200, like 120, my if statement on line 14 should run and say George is within the average speed of a hummingbird. If I run it again and I call my bird Sammy, how fast do his wings beat? If I put it outside of 50 to 200, I don't know, like 40, it should drop into the else statement, which should say Sammy might be sightseeing. So next, we're going to ask how much your bird weighs. I'm going to personalize the input prompt by saying, how much does Sammy weigh? I'm going to cast that to a float, and then I'm going to put that value in line. Nope, we're going to put that value in the variable called weight. We need it to be a float so we can do things with it. So I'm going to create an if statement based upon the weight of the hummingbird. So if the weight is more than 4.5, I'm going to tell him that Speedy weighs more than a nickel. Else, on line 24, I'm going to print that Speedy is the average weight of a hummingbird. All right, let's see if we can figure out how many flowers Speedy is visiting in any given day. So I'm going to create a prompt. How many flowers did Sammy visit today? I'm going to cast that to an integer, and I'm going to put it in the variable called nectar, all on line 28. so that I can compare it to some numeric value. So on line 30, if nectar is between 1,000 and 2,000, and then I have my semicolon tabbed in, we're going to print Speedy visited a typical number of flowers today. I'm going to use the comma separator for this print statement. When we were using the string format for other print statements, the print statements inside of my input, and then we'll say else on line 32, we will print Speedy had an unusual feeding day. Now we'll do one more about how many miles Speedy will travel. So on line 37, I'm going to prompt for the number of miles that Speedy has migrated, cast it to an int, and put it in a variable. And then I'm going to build an if statement for miles greater than or equal to 500 and miles less than or equal to 3,000. I'm going to print that Speedy has migrated a typical distance, else, that else statement on line 41, it's going to print that Speedy has traveled the unusual distance. So the one thing that makes this particular print statement, or these print statements, a little bit different, and if you'll notice the print statements on line 23 and 25, on line 31 and 33, are all using double quotes to surround the string values. The double quotes here, the double quotes here, the double quotes here. These are using single quotes. It looks like I'm missing one there. A single quote here and a single closing quote. I need to put my single closing quote there. Python is flexible enough that you can surround strings by double quotes, which is what we've always done in the past, or with single quotes, which is what the print statements on line 40 and 42 are doing. So now we're going to run it and see how it is working. So here's a perfect example of error checking. Code Sculptor is an interpreter. It is checking my programming or my program on the fly. So it is telling me, I see this purple line on line 23. The output statement is nice enough to give me an error message, although it's a little bit cryptic. It just says bad input. The nice thing is it is pointing to the line or highlighting the line where the error is. I'm going to have you pause for a minute and see if you can determine what is wrong with the print statement on line 23. If you decided that this is a curly brace instead of a parenthesis, let's run it and see if it'll work now. Very good. So I'm going to put in here Speedy. And if I do that, I will get our first if statement that says that's not very original. Then how fast do the bird's wings beat? So I'm going to put 200. It says Speedy must be sightseeing. How much does Speedy weigh? That is the prompt on line 20. If the weight is greater than 4.5, so if I put 5.1 or 5.2, it should hit the if statement and print that he weighs more than nickel. How many flowers did Speedy visit today? That is the prompt on line 28. I'm going to see if I can put something for the else on line 32. That means that I need something outside of 1,000 to 2,000. So if I put, 25, that should hit the else statement. Speedy had an unusual feeding day. And then the last one is miles, prompting me for how many miles Speedy has migrated. If I wanted to do the if statement, test the if statement, I would key in something between 500 and 3,000. If anything else outside of that range would print, they had an unusual distance. And so I'm actually going to key in the boundary value 500. What would you expect to happen if I key in the exact value 500? Line 39, if miles greater than or equal to 500. That is called a boundary value, and it's a good idea to test your boundary values. What would you expect to have happen? So if you said that it would drop into the if statement, because 500 is indeed greater than or equal to 500, you would have been right. Here is a boundary value, weight greater than 4.5. That does not include the boundary value. neither one of these boundary values, 50 and 200 on line 13, would be included in the if statement. 50 and 200 would not drop into the if, they would drop into the else. So it's important when you're testing that not only are you testing things that would drop into the if and things that would skip the if and drop into the else, but it's also very important that you're testing those boundary values.